Alex, let's dive into this. Tell people, like I actually don't know the whole story here. So I really am looking forward to this. How was Snowplow born?
It's a great question, Boris. It's quite a long and rambly story. I'll try and I'll condense it. I'll condense it. Don't worry. So Snowplow goes back quite a long way. So my co-founder Yali and I, we started the business. Well, we started the business as an open source project back in 2012. So we'd been working together for quite a while before that. We'd wanted to build a software company. We'd had a lot of fun working at software companies. And so we were on the lookout for something. And what we spotted, so we were doing kind of analytics projects for UK brands, and we spotted that they had really good kind of offline transactional data from, like the usual suspects, CRMs, ERPs, point of sale, all that kind of stuff, the sort of the customer database on a DVD kind of thing back in the day. But they didn't have good data on how their customers were kind of interacting with their websites. To a lesser extent, mobile apps, but websites was the big one back then. And so they'd say things like, oh, log into Google Analytics and get what you need. And that's not what we needed. We wanted every single button click, every single page view. And without sort of going into the deep history, Yali and I met at an ad tech firm. And so we sort of knew how those kinds of data pipelines were put together. And what had changed by 2012 was you could now start to build these things on top of AWS. So we thought, well, hang on, why don't we build this again? Why don't we make it run native on AWS, and why don't we open source the thing? And open sourcing was like the big innovation. It wasn't interesting to build another kind of SaaS sort of analytics collection thing. It was really interesting to kind of democratize it a bit, give it out. And if you think back then, there were so few data engineers out there. If we could build this thing and open source it, like a lot more companies could kind of get this capability and basically just end up with every single behavioral signal sitting in their own. I mean, it was before Redshift even, right? So it was like sitting in
Right.
S3. So that's how we started
Right.
it back in the day.
So this is actually very interesting to me. So it's so hard for people, I think, to remember what it was like. So in 2012, you were working with all these companies that had data, right?
They had
But you're
data.
saying
Yeah,
they had virtually no behavioral events or kind of in-app data.
exactly. Exactly. And it's really hard to imagine that now. Because
For
everybody's
sure.
like, oh yeah, let's put tracking into the app. But back then, I mean, so Redshift came out a little while after we started Snowplow. So we were very lucky to be on the private beta and ported Snowplow to sync into Redshift really early on. But back then it was you'd get all this, you try and get all this raw data and you'd put it into S3, and then you'd write these kind of crazy Hive scripts, which was this sort of hideous query language that sat on top of Hadoop. And it was all really clunky. But then, Redshift came out, and I think it took some time, but it made the idea of, oh yeah, of course, why wouldn't I store every single page view? It sort of normalized that. Took a couple more years, but yeah, it was super fun in the early days.
So you think it was the lack of this storage layer that made it hard for people to do this? Or because in my mind, I have just seen so many people these events, right? And now we live in a time
Yeah,
when it's assumed, right? Like
yeah.
of course everyone knows these exist now. But did you not have to teach people how to instrument their applications from the top?
Yeah, we did have to do a lot of that. So we did some pretty, I mean, we built our own trackers. We had to sort of say to people, yeah, look, you got to structure this in a certain way. We did quite a lot of thinking about kind of event grammars, sort of kind of subject, verb, action, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, people weren't that used. I mean, there were other people kind of educating the market at the time as well. So the product analytics vendors came out, people like Mixpanel, Heap, and not Heap, but Kissmetrics and people like that. So there were other people kind of saying you've got to track your users, you've got to instrument your app. So it wasn't just us, but we were very much you got to do this, and you got to own this, and you got to get all of this granular signal into your lake or your warehouse, and then work with it yourself. It was a big old trend. I think that the rise of mobile was a big part of it as well, because everyone on web had got quite comfortable with sort of, oh yeah, I just track page views and then my users are sessionized and all that kind of stuff. Whereas, that sort of, there was no rule book for mobile apps. And so everyone was like, oh, hang on, how do I instrument a mobile app? What am I trying to track in this thing? So yeah, it was a bit of a wild west for a while, I would say.
That's also an interesting insight. You're telling me that in the early days of mobile, they actually had better precise instrumentation than web pages because web pages were just kind of relying on page views.
Yeah, I think so. I think that mobile engineers in the early doors had to start thinking quite deliberately about what to track. Whereas on web, like actually just doing like automatic page view tracking has always given companies a lot of data. Like, I mean, obviously that's moved on and with Snowplow web tracking now, people do like really rich instrumentation and track different entities with the events and all that kind of stuff. But, back then it was kind of the world of tag managers, page views. We were before the whole kind of single page app craze,
Right, right. So
React, all that kind of stuff.
URLs were relatively good
Yeah,
indicators of
yeah,
what companies
yeah.
were users were doing.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it, Boris. Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if we have gone backwards or forwards, but that's a separate topic.
that is that is
Single
so
page
true.
applications are really nice. Some
Until they're
things are
not.
way more complicated than they need to be, you know?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, so true, so true.
in fact,
But yeah, that was.
would you say that which part of Snowplow over the last near decade, right? Which is
Yeah.
really
Oh, that
impressive,
makes it
Alex.
sound.
I
Yeah.
know. I hate to tell you, it's like you're reaching near decade. Um,
We've tracked down our first commit. We're planning a mini party for when
nice.
it's 10 years from the first commit. Yeah, yeah.
That's really good. That's really good. So, which part of the let's focus first on Snowplow, and then you and I can talk about the broader
Yeah,
stack.
the
But
industry.
within Snowplow, what has grown the most in complexity? Because the way people are
Oh,
building apps has changed, right? Like you said, it's not just web pages anymore.
oh, that's interesting. Okay, so I thought you were going to say like
You didn't
evolved.
see me going there.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say evolved the most, but actually it's kind of got most complex. Oh, that's a good question. I would say that the thing that we probably have done the most like thinking and development on is around like the schema technology. So like,
Hmm.
kind of, full like version JSON schemas for the events, the entities of the events, like auto like evolution of those, like automatically creating all those structures in the warehouses is a big lift. So that's probably like the most complicated individual piece. I would say the thing that we've kind of kept changing the most, kind of like, painting one of those bridges that you never finish, is probably like the run times. So when we started, like it was all sort of batch, Hadoop style stuff, and then we sort of ported all that to real time with Kinesis, and then we ported it all over to Google Cloud and stuff. So there's just been like so much. I don't want to say thrashing, but like sort of say thrashing. There's been so much like iteration on the kind of data processing fabrics over the last 10 years that like there's just always been a lot to keep up on with that side of things. But probably like business value wise, yeah, schemas.
Are those evolutions on the runtimes purely to keep up with the volume and speed at which data is being collected, or is it just hygiene of your internal?
It's kind of a bit of both. So like the runtimes, the frameworks are getting better, the services from the clouds are getting better. And so like, and so you just want to make that jump every so often to kind of get to the latest and greatest. So, I forget some of the changes we've made, even there's been so many, but I think like, Google Data Proc isn't as good as Data Flow and things like that. So they're just constantly iterating them, but they can only do so much on each generation, and then they'll bring out like a new wave of
Yeah.
tech. So it's pretty remorseless. I mean, being a data engineer and like working with all this stuff is just like, it's intense, I think.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think the general software industry likes to constantly reinvent itself, right? And data engineering is no different, I think.
Yeah, very
And
true.
arguably, maybe even worse because it's a younger side of the
Yeah,
industry.
yeah, yeah. I think that's so true. We haven't like got to our consensuses.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think I can see a long enough outlook in the history of computer science that like this may still settle
It's
down
not
to be a
over.
slower rate of change. Oh, it's definitely not over. Well,
It's not
can
over.
you guesstimate, Alex? And I know people self-host Snowplow, right? But
Yeah.
can you offer some sense of the volume of what people were collecting when you started versus now?
Oh, that's so hard to answer. So we're starting to put some telemetry into Snowplow and our open source setup options and stuff just to get a handle on it. It'll obviously be like super
Have you heard
non-intrusive.
that behavioral data collection is really valuable, Alex?
Do you know what? It's just total cobbler's shoes. It's just like ridiculous. It's like, what, you guys don't have like significant telemetry on Snowplow? Like, yeah, we're like, yeah, no, we've never really done that. It's hard to say. I think we're the third most deployed analytics tag on the internet. That's a little bit like, which is really cool. We
Yeah.
also have a lot of people use Snowplow across like networks, and they built their own like, behavioral data products on top and stuff. So there's also like in the individual instances of Snowplow that are on like, tens of thousands of websites and stuff. So it's really, we'll do the telemetry. I'll have a better answer then. But like, it's a good chunk. It's a good chunk of tracking, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, just to kind of come back to what you were saying earlier about how you've evolved the runtime, it's safe to say that you have the system that is Snowplow is dealing with a rate of events that is at least orders of magnitude larger than
Well, oh yeah, I mean, gosh, yeah. I mean, we have like users and customers doing like, a billion a day kind of thing. Like, and some of them they're often in kind of like gaming or like very high touch, like consumer apps and stuff like that, which are really fun categories. And like they've been pushing. We always have a customer that's like pushing our capability, and kind of that's a great place to be, and just adding zeros to it. It's great. And it's because as well, like the cost of storing, the cost of understanding this data has been just steadily declining over the last 10 years, which is just phenomenal, because it means you don't have to waste that time thinking, oh, should I collect that? Oh, like what's going to be the impact of that? You just get it in. It might be useful. It probably will be useful at some point. So just get all the data.
Do you think we've crossed that barrier for good? The idea that now you should think of events in a mind frame of abundance versus scarcity, like you should just collect anything and everything?
That's such a good question. I think we have, but on the other side, like, I know you guys and us, we're talking a fair bit about, the brain metaphor at the moment. And
Mm-hmm.
like, we have to accept that like like humans as organisms, we don't need to store all of our history of all signal.
Right.
So like, I think we can definitely, as a company, we can definitely afford to do that. But like, I think the next interesting question is kind of what's the cognitive load of like cataloging all that, and like, dealing with all the different, changes in metric definitions over the years and stuff. So I think that's going to be a really interesting debate in the industry.
Yeah. Let's get back to that in a second, because you made me think. You're right that we've been using this analogy that a good chunk of what the data organization and the data infrastructure is solving for companies is this, nervous system and central
Yeah.
brain. But you're right that we don't think about the fact that humans technically we forget for a reason, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And in all the talk about AI and amazing neural networks and all these things, the computer has perfect recall, and everything we know about humans that have perfect recall is that life is terrible, is what I've heard. I've heard that there are humans that have this, unfortunately, don't forget, right? And from what I've heard, it's like really bad in terms of like.
I've heard that it's like it messes them up, I think. So
Yeah.
it's tough. It's tough.
So are we going to have to build, there's probably a software idea in here for someone who's listening, like the judicious kind of forgetting,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Yeah. For like
should
different
we,
levels, it's still
yeah,
available in the the substrata, but like, like what level of the catalog do you actually need it at?
yeah, I mean, I don't know about
There's a
you, but
data, Boris. There's a data catalog like startup idea right here.
that's what I'm saying. I think that everyone's going to be focused on like precision and versioning, right?
Yeah.
But what about like
What
dropping
about
stuff on
forgetting?
purpose? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it. I
How
love
much
it.
better would I feel like if you, dropped 10% of your wardrobe secretly every year, like your life would probably be better. It's
Sounds
just
like you've seen it.
I mean, listen, we all,
We work in tech.
yeah, exactly. Well, is that, because I wanted to ask you about this because you mentioned it a minute ago that one of the areas that has really grown in the Snowplow product
Hmm.
is schema versioning. And
Yeah.
why is that?
Okay. Good question. I think it's because of the rate of change. It's because like you're evolving your understanding of your business. You're evolving your understanding of your customers. You're evolving your understanding of like the entities that are taking place and occurring with your customers. And so kind of by definition, you need to be able to kind of put a line in the sand and say, okay, that was like, version one of my product, my shopping cart or whatever, and here's version two, and I've learned, and I still want to be able to query across the old data, but I've got to change that version. And I think in the old days, a lot of people sort of hacked it by having like shopping cart one or shopping cart two as their like event names, but that's just sort of terrible. Like it's much better to sort of have versioning built into the data structures, and then you can evolve them. And that all plays quite nicely now with the warehouses and with like downstream modeling and DBT and stuff. So it's been really good. It's a big part of Snowplow, really.
I think we could give people a little bit more here because I think for a practitioner, this is probably really valuable. So where do you think people should manage this versioning? And let's think, because one of the interesting things about Snowplow, right, is where you sit in the modern data stack, and we'll get into this, and I mean, feel free to kind of position it as you will, right, is at the very front, right? Because collecting information is arguably the first step to do anything with data. So,
yeah, for sure.
So where should this versioning happen?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So we built that versioning into Snowplow. And so like it's built into when you track events with Snowplow, you're sending in these JSON payloads, but you're sending in a tag with it, which is like, oh, this is like my shopping cart version like 103 or whatever. And so we built it in right from the front, and then kind of the UI like lets you sort of evolve your schemas and add new versions and stuff. I think generally it has to be at the front. So we play quite nicely with Iteratively, which is a kind of a tracking plan software. I think there's a couple of others out there, but like fundamentally, I think you've got to be sorting this stuff out at source, really at the point where you're like instrumenting an app or whatever, because it's kind of like that age-old debate in data engineering around sort of schema on read versus schema on write. Like, do you decide up front what the structure is? Do you sort of figure it out once you've got all the data in the lake? But like what we found over the years, and like this is a philosophical debate, I know, and other people disagree with us, but what we've seen over the years is if you don't sort of nail it down at the top end of the funnel, then it just sort of proliferates as you go down it, and like the reliability kind of drops out the window, and you can end up in a world where you've just, you've got to have more analysts, you've got to have more like analytics engineers, you've got to have more people crunching this stuff in the lake or the warehouse, because basically it's just sort of JSON blobs and no one really knows what's in. So our philosophy has always been, and sometimes we've been sometimes the wider market's been sort of more on our side, sometimes it's been more like relaxed and like, oh, just throw in all the JSONs. But our philosophy has always been like, structure it out, version it out, like validate the data is what it thinks it is in the pipeline before it gets to like the warehouse.
You brought this up. We live in a world of multiple apps, right? Multiple sources of data just generally, whether that's mobile plus web, but I can't even imagine the number of sources people really have. How do you do that across sources?
So it's a really good question. So I think what we've seen is a couple of different things. So we've seen that like there are definitely source specific kind of events and maybe payloads that are relevant. They'll be relevant on web, but they won't be relevant on mobile or vice versa. But like equally, you can have entities which are basically the same. You can have structures which are basically the same from your different apps, from your different platforms. So maybe like, you define a unified view of a customer or like a product SKU or whatever. And you can then, and with Snowplow, you'd send those same payloads in via the different trackers from the different platforms. So like, and then in the warehouse, it would just be a singular like.
Got it. So to take your shopping cart example, right?
Yeah.
So if I could have a shopping cart on my website, but also humans, right? So how do you actually enforce that as a company? How do you do that well while maintaining agility when you have a mobile team and a web team that are different?
It is such a good question, Boris. I think that like, I don't think there's one answer. So I think you can solve it a bit with tooling. So like, we have the standard tooling, different teams can like log in and create the entities. We've seen all sorts. So we've seen like organizations that kind of say, okay, well, this has got out of hand. I'm just going to have like a single person or a single mini squad, and like all the structures have to go through that person. So they've kind of committified the thing. Or I'm quite interested in the whole kind of data mesh stuff and the idea of like producer domains. And could you have experts that are sort of sitting across all the production versus consumption? So I wish I had the answer. I think we see so many different ways of tackling that problem in different companies. And I think their current org structures, like the level of like analytics and data proficiency in the different like app teams is a big input as well. So yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a super tricky one. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this is one of those, right, where the more you create these versioning systems, which are undoubtedly valuable, right? I agree with you. Like, there's no way now that we live in a world of, to use my term earlier, of abundance, where you can kind of collect anything, and you should. Yeah. We need to come up with a layer on the software side that allows you to now deal with the fact that there's something from the past that no longer makes sense, right? And I think this is rudimentary, basically, in our field, broadly speaking. And some people would probably push for, don't version, just put it all in the warehouse and let someone, where there's a meeting point, right? The warehouse allows you to have a meeting point for all the data, even though you can always
do some cleanup and reinterpretation. And we now say to people, you can run that in your CI/CD. And so essentially, like, if you've got drift between like what you're sending in and what you're saying in terms of versions or schemas or structures or whatever, it'll just break the build. And that's quite powerful because that's just using the regular engineering guardrails rather than telling people, oh, you got to do this new thing and, you know, follow this new process or whatever. So that's probably the biggest breakthrough we've had in the area in the last couple of years because it's a gnarly problem. It's a people problem, really.
Yeah, yeah. And when I first started in software, this was at Microsoft, and there was tracking right built into the applications that Microsoft built
Yeah.
with. But of course, it was opt-in, not opt-out. It was a
Yep.
very different world than we live in on the web. It's hard to believe for people today, but it was opt-in. And the hardest part was actually having to think upfront about what to collect because the software
Yeah.
was going to go out in a box, right? The
Yeah.
software could not be updated post hoc. And
It's so
so
crazy to think like that now.
that was the hard part, right? And that would end
Yeah.
up in deep debates, very deep debates of should we collect broadly? Do we even know the questions we want to ask 6 months from now? So how do you craft the event collection for that? And those problems are largely gone because you can kind of do that on the fly anytime you want. And if you have a product that is a service that has a decent number of users, like you can always just do that later, right? And just get your answers,
I
a
mean,
week or a month later.
it's a great example. Like it's when you put it like that, the problem is so much more tractable now than it was back then. To
Yeah,
just be like, guys, we're not shipping DVDs. We can evolve this.
right. Yeah,
It's crazy.
we are seeing new sets of problems, like you said,
Yeah. Yeah.
where
Definitely.
whether that's organizational or long-term data management in a world now where you have too much. And by the way, the problem has always existed, in my opinion,
Yeah.
of I have data, whether that's events, whether that's literally scalars coming out of a database that's been
Yeah.
synced
We've
into
always
my
had it,
warehouse.
right?
You've always had this question of like, am I interpreting this correctly?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's where I think you've watched the technology evolve, you've watched the teams evolve, and so before I tend to lay my own perspective on what's going on in the modern data stack and kind of
I
the
want to
modern
hear
data.
that.
But how do you see the has the technology shifted and caused the change in team dynamics, or are companies just saying now I need to make sense of this data in a way that is scalable, and so they're investing in different architectures? What's the cart? What's the horse?
That's such a good question. I think that the forcing function wasn't the teams or the technology. I think that my kind of view on the market is that just a lot more companies started investing in both, kind of in parallel, sometimes more one, sometimes more the other. Sometimes they bought a load of tech and they didn't know how to deal with it. Sometimes they just hired like 5 data scientists who just sat in a room and like weren't sure what they were meant to do all day. But I feel like that whole wave was kind of, I don't know, like maybe started, I think it started a bit later in Europe than in the US, but like 2016, 17, 18, it was like flying. And I think that, I mean, when people sort of say, well, why did companies suddenly start taking it seriously? My view is that the sort of the digital native businesses had always taken it seriously. But then just generally like every industry by that time had its own Netflix, its own Uber, its own Airbnb, its own Amazon, whoever, who was just like, being winning really aggressively in their category. And, you look at those organizations and you think about what they do differently, and they do like 10 things differently or 100 things differently, depending on how you slice it. But one of the things they do really differently is, they take data really seriously. They invest heavily in tools. They hire great teams. They own their own data, all of these things. And so I think for me, that was the trigger point. And then that triggered people buying tools and staffing up teams. And then the teams would figure out the tools didn't do what they wanted to do, or the data scientists would figure out they needed more tooling or more like upstream engineering or whatever. And so I think it was just like, it was just a little bit of kind of organized chaos for a couple of years. And then I think we got into more like, feedback loops where like people are like, okay, yeah, like, we need analytics engineering, we need to bring in DBT, or like we need to make a new, like, we need to move from a on-prem warehouse into a modern cloud warehouse or whatever. And so I think things settled down a bit. But, I would say honestly, today, I think the strain is being felt much more on the team side. Like, the whole world is like massively short of data
Yeah,
engineers, analytics engineers, data scientists, and
yeah,
like the tooling I think is decent and it continues to evolve, but like there's not enough operators.
yeah, yeah. By the way, my perspective is, I think, somewhat similar to yours, and I think you put a really good button on it there. That ultimately, and this is probably cynical, is competition is always the truest form of
Budget.
pressure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the way I think about it is I guess that first era, right before Snowplow was born, right? That
Yeah.
the 2000s to 2010, early 2010s
Yeah.
era was that big data phase or whatever, which
Yeah.
broadly
Yeah.
speaking
Yeah.
now feels like we were selling snake oil, right? Whether that's, it's not that like
And
Hadoop wasn't interesting technology, but I feel like we were selling these companies like, oh, you're going to have petabytes of data and like just sprinkle some big data on it and you'll have value, right? And that actually didn't happen, at least not for a lot of companies.
it didn't happen. I think it was way more localized. So it was never that big in Europe. So like it was only
Mm.
really when Amazon did EMR and started to sort of democratize Hadoop that became a thing in Europe. Like I remember the company that Yali and I met at was an ad tech business, and it was 2008, and I was spending some time in Pasadena, and it was like, we've got big data, we've got to build a Hadoop cluster. And I was like, I had no idea what that meant. And one of the engineers, it was all like ex Overture go-to guys who knew what they were doing. He just went to like the hardware store, like bought a bunch of Dells, brought them back, and built a Hadoop cluster under his desk. And I was like, oh, that's a Hadoop cluster. So I had no idea about that stuff. And that was, yeah, so I totally agree with you. I think that first wave was like, yeah, it was snake oil. It was quite like, I think it was quite like localized as well.
Yeah. And then I think your take here that in each industry, a kind of very digital native company emerged, and now people are trying to figure out how do I behave like them. And now really that ship has really sailed, right? With this past year and a half,
Yeah.
where if you weren't strong on digital, you were going to have problems anyway.
You're in a pickle. Bryce, what's your view on the timings of it? Like, because I'm never quite sure on the timings. Like, when do you think, like, do you see a sort of specific inflection point?
Oof, this is a good question. So I, oh, this is a really good question, Alex. Okay, so here's how I remember it.
Yeah.
See, maybe I
Yeah.
can use it. I can
That's all we can
blame,
ever answer.
yeah, I can blame judicious forgetting here if I get it wrong. So I think there was that era of big data, and
Yeah, for sure.
outside of a few real companies, and maybe really Amazon is the true, kind of
Mm,
early correct user of data, and they had a really
mm,
strong internal data
yeah.
bus, right? And maybe Wall Street, believe it or not, probably had pretty good data
Mm,
bus architecture because they were doing kind of high speed messaging.
yeah,
This is the, TIBCO and all these
definitely.
things. So I think outside of those exceptions, people, my recollection is that the 2000s was, hey, you're going to have quantity of data, right? This was the, hey,
Mm,
Walmart, I have lots of stuff, right? Even Facebook, they were like, we have lots of stuff. And then it wasn't necessarily usable. So collecting it wasn't even necessarily
yeah.
that valuable. And so it's like, okay, how do we store it and process it? Great. Okay, so we had these technologies to store it and process it, which were not even that easy, but at least they existed. But there's just not that much value to extract out of the data. The joke we used
Yeah,
to
I
say
agree.
on my team was like, it's big, but it's dumb. And I think there's a story even about early days when Facebook was trying to build an ad product, and they're like, we're going to figure out how to
Yeah.
target ads to the people who like, Lexuses or whatever the term is. And they thought with all the data they had that they could just infer it from the
Yeah.
existing data set, and they couldn't. And so they ended up just saying, let's just add a checkbox for the user to check. And then lo and behold, because they have so many users so active in the product, like you could just instrument and get the information you wanted. So this idea that you could get kind of magical insight out of just lots of data turned
Yeah.
out to not be true for most people. And there was a lot of investments around that. And so that was a very much a, let's call it thinking slow, right? And
Yeah.
how to get something out of that. And I think what's shifted, and then in the 2010s, my view is your world really exploded, whether that's
Mm,
through direct multiplexing, from a behavioral collection tool directly into behavioral analytics tools, right? I think,
hmm
to me, I think of the 2010s as the decade of yeah, Mixpanel and Snowplow, et cetera. And that made you able to iterate very fast on behavior in your app to
Yes.
outcomes.
Yes.
And
Totally agree.
and when you talk about teams are the constraints, to me, we're on a continuum of what I would probably call like software engineering thinking. Not necessarily that everyone's
Mm,
becoming a software engineer, but you want to have the agility and the kind of feedback loops that we get in software on across the entire business. And so I think of
yeah.
collecting events and seeing them in a funnel in Mixpanel, like what I got to do in 2012, right,
Yeah.
was pretty magic. And how quickly you could just be like, wait, if I change the sign up sheet, like the sign up funnel changes, and you could see that right away.
Yeah. It's
That
big.
was the shift for me. And then that changes the expectations. And then what happens, and again, I can't put the inflection point on it, but there was an explosion of quantity of sources of data. So you talk about web and
Yeah.
mobile. I think it went web and mobile plus like 100 different SaaS products.
The SaaS products, like getting you spot on, like getting the data out of the SaaS products into the warehouse was a huge, like, everyone suddenly was using Stitch and Fivetran and things like
Yeah.
that. That was a huge, like, oh, I can mine this and get some really interesting insights from it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when Census was born in 2018, and I think the platforms and the pieces, the technology was there at that point. But people, I think, were still working on combining that data, right? They were very much, how do I take what I'm getting from a Snowplow, what I'm getting from a Stripe, what I'm getting
Yeah.
from a HubSpot, and like, how do I combine this? It's like, and you know, you came from ad tech, right? And some of my teammates came from ad tech as well. Like that world was all about this magical identity resolution problem, right?
Oh yeah.
That was really only 80% correct. So the DMP leads to, kind of this magical user identity.
It's been like they've
And
been chasing
yeah,
chasing that like unicorn for like 15 years.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And my key view was they will never care about being precise because it's not what advertising is about, right? It's
Yeah.
you, as long as you hit like, hey, if I can give you an audience of potential Lexus buyers, like that's within 80%, that's fine. That's good
Yeah.
enough. And what the companies we were working with were really trying to do was much more precise, right? But they were now like,
Yeah.
these are our
Exactly.
users. I don't want to send an email to a customer that is using this feature and telling them about this feature because they haven't used it. I explicitly don't want to do that. And so I think there was a little work in 2018, 2019 for people to figure out, both in terms of skill and tools, how do I stitch my data together? And I think you could put that in parallel with the rise of DB. And then once that started to come together, like then things kind of went through the roof for us on the Census side. But I actually don't know if the invention of Redshift was a catalyst here. Even Snowflake and BigQuery, I think, were a slow burn towards like their
Mm,
real impact. And for me,
yeah.
their main
Snowflake
impact has
did.
been shifting the operational burden down, right? So that you didn't have to manage this cluster anymore. You could just spend dollars and just have it.
Yeah.
And that changed who could do this stuff. Because to your point, there's not enough technically proficient people in the data space. So the
Yeah.
ecosystem had to provide more kind of in the box.
I think you're totally right. Those guys took a lot of cost and maintenance out of that stuff. Your point around the kind of, ad tech is always a sample. That was always true culturally as well in early like web analytics days. So, it was, in the early days of people using, like Omniture and GA and stuff, people were coming from a marketing background, they were coming from the idea of surveys and samples. And so the idea that kind of web analytics would just be a sort of a best effort sample was really strong. And I remember really vividly, like the first time we had a customer who was like, no, I'm using this event count for like regulatory reporting. And we were like, yeah, of course you are. Like this is incredibly important. Like, you need your event stream to be accurate and complete. And, that kind of sample culture is just not, yeah, that's changed a lot in the last few years.
Yeah. I think it'll be really funny if 5 years from now we're talking about dropping events on purpose to, create this forgetful analytics. And then we're going backwards towards the ad tech world. But it'll be
Definitely.
we're dropping the right events, not the random events. We're dropping just the right ones, just the ones you want to forget about.
Exactly.
So Alex,
It's awesome stuff.
you, given where you are physically in the world,
Yeah,
you've been,
I'm in London, by the way, for
I
anyone
know,
listening.
I know. Oh yeah. For people listening. Yeah. Alex is in London. If the accent wasn't obvious. Um, you've been closer to another shift in our space that I want to ask you about, which is the data infrastructure, let's call it broadly, all of it, right? The modern data stack, the behavioral data collection, all of that,
Yeah.
and targeting of users and personalizing our outreach to customers, et cetera. How have you experienced the combination of that with modern regulations and privacy?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So I mean, we've really seen it firsthand. I think for a couple of reasons. First things first, I should say, like our biggest market is the US, but after that, depending on how you count, it's either the UK or Germany, and Germany has led the way on some, very like strong and clear like privacy regulations, and GDPR is well known, and CCPA in the States and things like that are well known as well. So I guess we've seen it firsthand, and we have a lot of German customers and Dutch customers and others that take this stuff super seriously. We have customers all over the world, obviously, who take this super seriously. I think the other thing that's kind of meant we kind of get the phone call more often is that, like, we have the open source, and then the way we deploy for our customers is we run a private SaaS model, which means we run Snowplow for those customers in their own cloud account, which is a little bit different from, like a SaaS vendor where you send all the events to, acme.com or whatever. And so in GDPR language, we are the data processor, not the data controller. So we're like a software vendor powering this technology, but we're not, no one's updating their agreements to say this, this behavioral data is being sent to Snowplow. It's not. So we've seen it all kind of really, we've had a ringside seat. What are the things I would draw out? I think the things I would say are, this direction is like the direction of travel. I don't think, different parts of the world will go at different speeds, and some of it will be done, federal levels or state levels or whatever, but it's the direction of travel. I think that a lot of the SaaS vendors, or the vendors that are kind of very much about, we'll send all the data to us with multi-tenant, all that kind of stuff, I don't think they're necessarily sort of engaging with this direction of travel as much as they should. And certainly, like, we have those conversations with our customers, and, they take this data ownership super seriously. I think that fundamentally, like, if an organization is trying to use this behavioral signal in a very like transactional or like, zero sum style way with the data subjects, I don't think they're going to do well as a business. So I do think, okay, sometimes the regulations are a little bit onerous, or they land in a slightly clunky way. But like generally, I think organizations, if they take the regulations seriously, they'll end up in a better place. They'll build better data products. They'll understand their customers better. They'll have like better relationships with those customers. So I do like, I think it's here to stay. I don't think the industry is taking it as seriously as it should, and I think that individual organizations will do better if they take it serious. So I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, that's a good starting point. I actually want to go one level past that. So let's take it seriously. How would you advise our companies today? And Census is just like you, a data processor purely, right? How would you advise our customers to design their infrastructure so that it's ready for this, or that it can adapt to these ever-changing kind of expectations of users around privacy?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think that my advice would be, like, try and document, or even better, capture with the events, like, or whatever other extracts you're running. Try and capture the kind of the why of, like, why are you collecting this? Kind of what kind of purposes are you going to put it to? If you're collecting it inside your business to better understand, better perform your business, then, like, most things like GDPR and CCPA are very supportive of that. Like they want companies to understand their customers better. But it's just, I think, just try and get that metadata layer in and try and track the kind of the why, because it just means you're better set up for later, for like, oh, why were we collecting that? Oh, like, that looks a little bit like, personal information. Like, why are we tracking it in that way? So document, I think, is important, and think as much as you can about what are the downstream use cases and the data products you're gonna build, and use that to inform your tracking. It's hard, but
on the collection side, Alex, like there's an interesting chasm, right, between a visitor and a user, correct?
Yeah. So by that you mean an anonymous visitor versus
Right.
like a logged in user.
Yeah, I think most Americans have noticed when they go to a lot of websites now that there's this cookie like prompt at the very beginning of every website.
Yeah, we've had that in Europe for like
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Chaos.
So the reason that exists, right, is because the earlier I can get consent, the earlier I can build my funnel around the anonymous user's activity. Is that a good way to describe it for people?
Yeah, that's a really good way to describe it to people. And a really good example of that is media. So like newspaper groups and publishing houses and people like that. And like a lot of those organizations are now working really hard to kind of get the anonymous reader into like a logged in format, start serving them more bespoke things, but also like understand who they are versus, not have an anonymous visitor that hasn't given consent, etc. So yeah, great example.
So would you advise companies, like I've seen companies spend a lot of time on anonymous to identified stitching, right? It's just trying to figure
Oh
it
yeah.
out. Even in the data warehouse, right? I've seen people write
Oh yeah.
non-trivial amounts of, SQL code, right, to figure
Oh
this out.
yeah. It's
Is
huge.
that, yeah, is that something companies should invest in? Do you think that this is something that we will eventually want to move away from as a practice and treat anonymous users totally differently? How would you advise our shared, we have customers that build SaaS, right? Like you and I,
Yeah,
a
yeah,
lot of us
yeah,
guys at
yeah, yeah.
Scarcity. How should they approach this over the next, 5 years?
Ah, that is such a good question for us. We should probably write a point of view on that. I
Right?
think that so in the in the short term, so let's take the example of like a B2B SaaS company that has, a good ticket price and they're doing like anonymous content marketing and then people sign up and buy the product. So I think that's a nice simple example. So in that world, they have anonymous users, but they're probably not running any kind of crazy like ad tech style network. So it's probably just anonymous users to their site. In that world, like they can still have first party cookies. They can still do that stitch if that user, after a long cycle converts and becomes a paying customer. So my view in that scenario is, continue to do the stitch. It's still really helpful to understand this person that just bought, the enterprise plus tier has been like checking your content anonymously for the last like 6 months or whatever. So that will all still work. I think it gets much more sticky when you've got an organization that's trying to do kind of more like network, more like ad techy stuff, more like sort of tracking a network, third party cookies, like all of that stuff. Like I wouldn't start a new project doing that stuff today because it's just the direction of travel on that stuff is just more restrictive. Those cookies are going away. So yeah, we should probably write something to be clear on this because a load of our customers do identity stitching. They get a lot of value out of it, but it's really important to understand kind of what works there and what's going to keep working for, some years versus what's a fool's errand. It's a great
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. Well, and even on the other end, right? So you mentioned it in passing there, and let me finish with this question on this topic, which is the warehouse
Yeah.
is singular, right? And one of the things I try to push for most companies that are not massive multinational companies are to have a single warehouse, right? The
Yeah.
beauty of especially BigQuery and Sales and Snowflake, right, is you really don't have to sacrifice, the complexity. Like you can have one storage layer and have
Yeah.
any number of execution warehouses, right? Which is wonderful.
Yeah.
And so, in a world where the warehouse is a singular entity, how should teams, companies, data teams, how should they think about structuring the data post collection, right, for the various use cases, some of which should have access to PII and some of which should not, right?
Yeah, that is such a good question, Boris. I think there's definitely different ways of doing it. I mean, we see everything in the customer base. So we have customers who are running different pipelines for regulatory reasons, different warehouses, etc. But I think if you're inside the same warehouse, yeah, exactly what you said. You've got to think about what is the kind of exposure area, what's the surface area of sensitivity for that data product, for that use case, and if you can kind of slice that into its own mart and only certain people have like login credentials to browse that, or only certain users of like Census can like access that and lift that data back into a downstream application. I think that's got to be a good thing. So like try and design those downstream data sets against the data products you're building and like principle of least access. That's got to be like, again, I think it's such a good question and we should probably write about it, but that's got to be a good
Yeah.
design. I
Yeah.
think in general, there's a real shortage of like material in our industry around how you should build data products. Like I think that these sorts of things are exactly the sort of missing topics, I think.
Yeah. Of the customers that that do this well, do they just make a hard physical separation? They just run two pipelines? The ones that are very concerned about something like
Yeah,
private data or health data.
most concerned user or customer would have like completely sandboxed pipeline and warehouse. I think they've done it. I think I only know of people doing that on a geographic regional basis, but you could do it for anonymous versus logged in as well if you really wanted to. I don't think I've seen that. I'd have
Oh,
to check.
interesting.
I don't think
Interesting.
I've
I
seen
hadn't
that
even
because
thought of that.
you could literally flip the collector once someone logged in. I don't like someone will shout at me and say, "Alex, we have customers doing that." Always happens to me.
That's
But yeah,
Yeah, that's a really, I mean, the funkiest thing I've learned about this topic in the last, I don't know, 6 to 12 months is that Australia is a
oh,
safe haven for most regulations. So I met a
I did
company.
not know that.
I know, I was kind of surprised about this too. And I didn't go do my first party research. So I just took them. They were a large enough company that I trust what they were saying here. But
Yeah,
basically, because there are different regulations in EU, UK, US, et cetera, right? That it
yeah,
turned
yeah.
out this was an American company, no joke. And they would home their data in Australia because at
Oh,
least
interesting.
Australian rules were compatible with everyone else. I was like, that's neat, but it's also a tremendous amount of latency you're adding to your system for everyone. But hey, that's good for Australia, I guess. This could be an interesting.
Good.
We might see the rise of
It's the data
political
Switzerland.
data havens. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah, I
Which
love it. I love it.
we didn't even get into that, but I'm very curious, or I don't know if it's concerned, but I'm definitely apprehensive about kind of the geographic balkanization that's happening for
Yeah,
software. And
yeah.
that's a different topic probably for you and I for a different day. But I do think I mean, I think software
I
can
agree.
solve it, right?